Hi, and welcome back to Bickering with Brad. I'm your host, Bradley Bullock. Today we're going to be talking about NFL domestic violence policies and what all that entails. Today I'm joined by our guests, Ben Gladowski and Destiny Washington. So the NFL has a policy of a 6-game suspension for first-time offenders. Do you think this is enough?
I think that it is enough because 6 games is kind of a lot. And I mean, in that time, someone can definitely take your place, show you up, and you're going to be missing a lot in those 6 games.
Well, I personally think that a 6-game suspension isn't really that long. That's not even a week. I think it should be, from the NFL's perspective, it should be more aggressive.
Yeah, so last year we had the Ray Rice suspension. He was found a video where he punches his girlfriend at the time on the elevator. They originally gave him a 2-game suspension and then gave him an indefinite suspension. Do you think the NFL's been consistent with their domestic violence policies, or do you think they were fair in their treatment of him?
I don't think they've been consistent. I definitely think with different people, they have different suspension times. But with him, I think whenever the video came out, that was like a definite meaning that it was time for him to get suspended, because I think with most jobs, if you do get in that kind of legal trouble, domestic violence, you're more than likely going to get fired.
Like, I'm glad to see that the NFL is understanding that it needs to be more aggressive, that it's making those changes over time. But again, I still think that the NFL needs to really get itself in gear and get serious about its players committing crimes when they're not on the field.
Yeah, I think that the NFL's been rather inconsistent in how they go about their suspensions. So for Ray Rice, they really didn't move forward with a hardcore suspension until the video came out, and there's been a lot of discrepancy on whether they saw that video before TMZ released it. But then you look at Ezekiel Elliott this year with a 6-game suspension. His charges were dropped in court, and they still are trying to get that 6-game suspension, but they're going through a lot of different things. Well, thank you. That's all the time we have today. Thanks for joining us. I'm Bradley Bullock, and catch us again tomorrow night. Hi, and welcome back to Bickering with Brad. I'm your host, Bradley Bullock. Today we're going to be discussing domestic violence policies in the NFL. I'm joined by our guests, Ben Gladowski and Destiny Washington. The NFL currently has a 6-game suspension policy for any domestic violence issues. Do you think this is enough?
I do think that it's enough. 6 games is a lot to miss, especially in such a short season. Someone can definitely show you up, take your place during that time. You can lose your I guess what you're doing in the game, so I think it's enough.
Look, I think that the NFL really needs to be more aggressive than 6 games. These players stick around for a long time throughout the whole season, the postseason too. I think that 6 games is hard, but I think they really need to get serious about the crimes that their players commit.
I tend to agree that they need to be serious about it. They currently have the 6 games for first-time offenders and then an indefinite suspension. We look back to Ray Rice. He was originally suspended for 2 games when he struck his girlfriend at the time on an elevator, and then later suspended indefinitely when a video came out. Do you think they've been consistent in their rulings?
I don't think so. I mean, even with him, they only suspended him for 2 games, and then this video came up, and so they're like, oh, we should really do something else about this, and they suspended him. So I think that maybe after Ray Rice, that's whenever they started trying to be more consistent, because people were claiming that they weren't consistent.
Yeah, I agree with Destiny. I'm glad to see that the NFL's taking its policies more seriously. I do think they still need to be more aggressive, but I'm glad to see that they went from 2 to 6 with Ray Rice.
Yeah, and this year we look at Ezekiel Elliott. His domestic charges were dropped, and then the NFL pursued an investigation, and now he's been in court fighting a 6-game suspension, and he still hasn't served his suspension. So do you think they're trying to make up with the whole fiasco with Ray Rice?
Definitely, because he wasn't even charged. It could have been someone's word, her word against his. So, I don't know. His case is kind of a tricky one because he was never really charged for that crime.
Well, thanks for joining us. That's all the time we have for today. I'm Bradley Bullock. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow night.
Oh. Hi, and welcome to Stay in Your Lane. I am your host, Lane Blank. Today, we are going to be talking about how we put athletes on pedestals. For that, I am joined by Juliana Clemson and Blake Verwert. So guys, how big of an issue do you think this is?
Personally, I believe it's an undisputed fact that athletes that are stars in college are put on pedestals. They're seen as celebrities. It's a known fact. And the best example I have for this is two-time All-American Oklahoma athlete Brian Bosworth from the late 80s. He was literally acted like he was a celebrity in college. I mean, he opted out, like he couldn't even play in his bowl game against Arkansas because he was such a big head, and then he moved on to the next level, and he was one of the biggest flops of all time. I mean, it doesn't get much worse than that.
You're not wrong.
Yeah, and other athletes such as Vince Young, Johnny Manziel, and RG3. Manziel and RG3 both won the Heisman, so they were, the media portrayed them as celebrities, and I believe that they became overconfident and got too much of a big head, and that's why they weren't successful in the NFL.
All right. How do you guys think players fare in the NFL who weren't idolized in college?
I think that some of the most successful pro players are ones that are going into the next level ready to learn, ready to be shaped, ready to learn from the more older veteran players. I mean, they're accepted better by, their teammates. People who are already in the NFL, they don't want someone who expects something. Like, they want someone who's ready to work for it, and that's what I think on it.
Right, putting the team effort.
Yeah, players like Tom Brady, he was a 6th-round pick, was not idolized in college. He was kind of an afterthought in the draft, but he went in the NFL. He worked hard. He studied film. He really wanted to be an NFL quarterback, even though he wasn't idolized in college, and he turned out to be one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time.
Awesome. All right. Well, that is all the time we have for today. Thank you guys so much for joining us, and we'll be back here tomorrow night.
Welcome back to Jaeger Time. I'm Lauren Jaeger, and today we will be discussing the use of performance-enhancing substances in the NFL. Today I'm joined by Melanie Ripple and Lane Blank. So just this week, the New York Jets wide receiver was suspended for 4 games for violating the NFL's policy on PEDs. Do you guys think 4 games is a big enough punishment?
I do think 4 games is a big enough punishment because the players are paid per game, and so 4 games is 25% of the season and 25% of the paycheck.
I also agree with Melanie. It is a lot of money that they are getting, considering that is what they do for a living and that is their career. So that's a pretty big percentage of their paycheck for the year.
Yeah, I agree. Do you guys think the NFL is doing enough to test for the PEDs?
I mean, I know that different organizations do it differently, like UFC, they definitely are tested through the USADA, which is more intense testing. It can be whenever, and it's year-round, whereas in the NFL, they have a player union contract that lets players go free for the off-season, so they don't have to be tested during that, which I think is kind of a bad idea. I'm back and forth on that, but I think you could definitely step it up.
Yeah, what do you think, Melanie?
I think it's really easy, or a lot easier for players to get away with not being tested. So I don't really think they get tested enough.
Okay. How do you guys personally feel about players using these substances?
I honestly think that it's not even worth it. Like, I don't get why you'd risk your career to do it. And also, if you're trying to get better, you don't need PEDs to get better. It takes a good coach and a good organization to win games. Take the Patriots or even the Steelers, for instance. They don't use PEDs, but if you have bad coaching and a bad organization, you're going to lose games no matter what, even if you are on PEDs. Take the Browns.
How do you feel? Okay, well, that's all we have for today for Jaeger Time. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.
Welcome back to Debates with Destiny. Today we're going to be talking about political involvement in sports. And for that, I'm joined with guests Bradley Bullock and Ben Glodowski. So guys, recent political protests in sports has been a big topic. Do you think that this is kind of taking away from the enjoyment of the game?
Look, it might be taken away from the enjoyment of the game, but I think that really it brings a lot of attention to things that the American public really needs to pay attention to, that people are treated right in the workplace, that people aren't, committing crimes or anything. I think all this politicalization is really good for us in the end.
I think people use sports kind of as a getaway and tend to let that be their outlet where they can just kind of get away from the rest of the world. But as Ben kind of mentioned, I think politics is something that's very pervasive in all of what we do nowadays, and I think it's something that's important to continue through sports, even though people just want to watch it.
I agree. So Colin Kaepernick has been a topic for so long now. Do you guys think that what he did was a right move? Should he have done it on the field, kept it off the field?
Well, look, I personally I agree with Kaepernick. I think that the right time is the right place, and that's all that there is to it. But that's not to say that everything that you have a statement about needs to be made on national public football television or anything. I think that there's a lot of discretion to be had, but Kaepernick was in the right.
And I think a lot of people fail to realize that Kaepernick used to sit on the bench during the national anthem, and Nate Boyer is a teammate on the 49ers at the time, and he went up to Nate Boyer and talked about what would be a more respectful way for me to protest. And Boyer, a military vet, and Kaepernick came up with the solution of him kneeling during the national anthem, and that's really when it caught attention, was during the preseason. So I think a lot of people don't fully understand the story and how much precautiousness Kaepernick took into consideration before he decided to kneel.
I agree. All right, that's all the time we have left today. Thank you guys for watching. We'll see you back here tomorrow night.
Good morning and welcome back to Jammin' with Jules. Today I'm joined with Blake Brewer and Lane Blank, and the topic on the table is who is the best conference in college football? So let's get right into it. Where do you stand, guys?
Well, I'd like to start by pointing out that Paul Feinbaum, who many know as the voice of the SEC, said last year that the Big Ten was the best conference in college football. You have to take into consideration that last year when LSU played Wisconsin, LSU was ranked number 2, and Wisconsin went into that as 5th or 6th, but they ended up beating them. I feel like the Big Ten has a little bit more in-depth, more variety, because the SEC is basically more or less run by Alabama, whereas the Big Ten has multiple teams competing for that number 1 slot.
And to go off of that, the Pac-12 has also made huge strides to bring their conference back into the fray of things. They have 3 teams in the top 25 currently: Washington, Washington State, and USC. And Washington went to the college football playoff last year, so they have really solidified themselves as a top program in the country. And also the Pac-12 coaching has improved, such as Chris Peterson and Mike Leach for Washington and Washington State, respectively. And they've done a good job to develop their players throughout the years. Players such as John Ross, Adoree Jackson from USC, and Solomon Thomas from Stanford were all first-round picks last year from the Pac-12. So they've really done a good job of developing players for the next level.
I won't argue with you. These other conferences, they are starting to close the gap, but coaches like Kirby Smart are saying that the key to closing the gap isn't just recruiting top players, it's developing them once they get on campus. And it's a known fact that Nick Saban and Kirby Smart are pulling in these 5-star recruits. I mean, the SEC had 6 teams in the top 15 recruiting classes of 2017, and they pulled in a total of 11 5-star recruits out of all the 5 stars that were pulled in 2017. But, teams like Alabama and Georgia are just going to keep on picking up the slack where other teams are letting them down. But I guess we'll just have to see what happens in the college football playoff at the end of this year. That's all we have for tonight. Thank you so much, and tune back in tomorrow.
Hello, and welcome back to Mic'd Up with Melanie. I'm your host, Melanie Ripple. Today we will be talking about CTE in the NFL, and I am joined by Lauren Yeager and Ben Glodowski. There was a recent study showing signs of CTE in former NFL players. Do you guys think the NFL should be held accountable for this?
I personally feel like the NFL should not be held accountable because I feel like it's kind of common sense when you're signing up to play such a contact sport like football. You should assume that eventually or somehow you're going to be putting your body at risk for lifelong or life-lasting injuries.
Well, look, I think that the NFL does bear some responsibility. At least I recognize, players need to know they're getting into some sort of dangerous sport. But I think the NFL needs to do everything that's within its power to prevent players from suffering through this kind of thing. And I think that study really shows its good faith to do that.
What do you guys think the NFL can do to prevent this?
I feel like the science behind CTE is still kind of iffy and gray. And so I feel like the NFL just needs to dig deeper into this disease, and it simply just needs more funding and more attention. And I feel like eventually they could develop a test to diagnose CTE in active athletes rather than just in autopsies. So that's kind of the hard thing, is you don't know anything about this disease until you test it on someone who's already deceased.
Yeah, I agree. You know, the NFL has a lot of tools at its disposal to combat these sort of things, you know, from its safety equipment to its tackling procedures. And it already does a lot of these things. It's just a matter of finding out what's the right balance of safety equipment to, you know, getting the sport played.
So I think that the refs can definitely do like a better job of flagging bad hits and making more targeting calls or more fines for nasty hits and stuff like that. So how do you guys think that might, how do you guys think the regulations might affect the game?
I think that the NFL referees need to tread lightly. You know, they do need to recognize that there's new rules that need to be put in place, but at the same time, I think that we tread into territory where we start affecting how the game is played on a pretty fundamental level.
Okay, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you, and we'll see you next week.
Hey, welcome back to Sleeves Rolled with Ben. I'm your host, Ben Gladowski. Today I got a fever and the prescription is not Tylenol. Today I've got Bradley Bullock and Destiny Washington here to talk about Mississippi State and their cowbell tradition. So what do you guys think? Is this good? Is it bad? What do you got?
I think people love the college football atmosphere, and I think the cowbell for Mississippi State has been one of those pillars in their traditions, and I just think that it's something that the SEC should want to continue. It's something that Mississippi State should fight for, and it's a huge part of their program.
Yeah, agreeing with him, I agree that it's like a big like kind of tradition for them, and it's like what brings fun to the game, and I think it's kind of a bad idea to ban it.
Yeah, so the SEC in 2010 made the Great Cowbell Compromise. In the 70s, they outlawed them in general, and so now they're back, you know, 7 years on. The Mississippi State tried to do the Ring Responsibly campaign. How do you guys think that's turning out? Do you think that fans are going well with it? Is it good for the conference?
I think the fans are doing what they can. I think it's easy to get caught up in a game, especially when a big play happens or something, especially for fans that have done the cowbell for so long. Their first reaction is going to be to ring the cowbell. So I think they're doing what they can. It's also going to be hard for any Mississippi State personnel to really manage, like if a fan rings the bell when they're not supposed to, are they supposed to kick them out, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think it is kind of like hard to like if someone does ring it, like what happens? Like will they get kicked out? Well, who gets fined? It's kind of just like a tricky situation. They don't know like what to do.
Yeah, so from the player's perspective, what do you think that this is all about? What do you think that you know, the opposing players are thinking? Do you think that we should ban them for them?
I think opposing players are pretty happy with it just because, I mean, it's a noise maker. Anytime you go into an opposing stadium, the more noise, the more difficult it is for offenses to run their plays, to get play calls in. So I think opposing players are all for it, but at the same time, they know that a trickle-down effect could affect their home traditions as well.
Yeah, I feel like the opposing teams are probably happy about it because, I mean, when you are trying to focus, you don't want a lot of noise going on. But, I mean, it's part of the tradition. It's part of the game. It's part of the experience. So.
Yeah. Thanks, guys, for coming in to talk about cowbells. We'll have more to talk about next week. Tune in.
Good morning and welcome back to Breaking It Down with Blake. And today we will be discussing the college football playoff system. And I'm joined by Juliana Clipson and Lane Blank. So guys, what are y'all's opinions on the college football playoff system currently?
In my opinion, the college football playoff system as is much better than the BCS. It takes into consideration many more factors when deciding rankings and who's going to make it, and like strength and schedule, conference championships, weather, injuries, head-to-head results. I mean, this bracket system creates more fairness, in my opinion, than the BCS.
I feel like I agree with you on some points that I like that they take into consideration the strength of schedule, but I also feel like if you had a different system, there would be more chances for smaller schools to get in because right now they have a little bit of a rough time if you're a smaller school getting into a big conference league when you're put up against powerhouses like the SEC and the Big Ten. While they can get in with losses, smaller schools that are going undefeated don't get in at all.
So if there were, like, say, an 8-team playoff, what kind of issues would arise from that?
Well, I feel like this isn't going to happen for a little while because they're letting because that would let more teams into the playoffs, and then that would make the bowl games less meaningful. And the NCAA makes a lot of money off of these bowl games, and since since that means that you're not going to have as much money, that means that money is really just the big issue of the whole entire thing.
So, I mean, if there was an 8-team playoff, just throwing this out there, what if the teams that lost in the first round still were able to get a bowl game? I mean, would that solve the money issue? I mean, we'd still have the fairness of the 8-team playoff. I mean, I do believe it would create more fairness, but I don't know, just throwing that out there. What if they still were able to get a bowl game before the season was over?
Well, those are all very interesting facts, and that's all the time we have for today, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Hi, and welcome back to Bickering with Brad. I'm your host, Bradley Bullock. Today we're going to be talking about the changes made to the baseball in the World Series and how that affected the World Series. I'm joined by our guests Melanie Ripple and Lauren Yeager. So did you think that the new baseball had an impact on the World Series?
I definitely think it did have an impact. It obviously affected the outcome of the game, but I feel like if we're looking at it like this, both teams were given a new ball, and I feel like it wasn't a disadvantage to one team over the other, so they both had to kind of learn how to work throughout the World Series with a new ball, and so it kind of disadvantaged both of them equally.
I think it definitely affected the game. It made it harder for the pitchers to throw the ball and easier for the batters to hit the ball. And there was like a spike in home runs in the postseason. So
with the changes to the ball, as you just mentioned, home runs went out through the roof. Do you think that makes it more exciting for viewers and fans?
I definitely think it makes it more exciting because baseball can kind of be slow at times, and so I feel like it kind of, and this is like the biggest 7 games of the season, and so I feel like for fans and people watching, it kind of made it more exciting and more like really like pumped up.
yeah, I definitely think it made the game more competitive.
Yeah, I think the home runs really made fans enjoy it. The ratings this year were up compared to last year, and you had 2 fairly big teams, big market teams in the postseason last year. I think for more traditional baseball fans, the home runs were probably not what they wanted to see. For instance, you had I think 25 runs in Game 5, and the game was almost 5 hours long. So for some people, it might have dragged on a little bit too much with all the home runs. Did you guys watch any of the World Series at all, and how did you think it went?
Yes, I watched every game. I thought it went well, but I can obviously see the perspective of where you're coming from, where fans who follow these teams every year, kind of that's not what they expected to see, but I still kind of think it gave it a different spin to the games, what everyone's used to seeing.
All right, well, thank you so much for joining me today. That's all we have for Bickering with Brad. Tune in again tomorrow.